The dawn broke over Greystone National Park with a gray, overcast sky that seemed to press down on the forest like a heavy blanket. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around the base of the trees in ghostly tendrils. Ethan Cole had spent another restless night in the cabin, the walls creaking under the strain of the Watcher's oppressive presence. The whispers had receded with the first light of day, but their echoes still lingered in his mind, a constant reminder that he was not alone. He sat at the small wooden table, staring at the map spread out before him. His eyes traced the lines of the trails, the landmarks, the places he had already searched. But there was one area that he had yet to explore, a place that Mrs. Havisham had mentioned in passing during their conversation: the old village. Ethan hadn't given much thought to the idea of a village deep in the forest. It didn't appear on any of the official maps, and there was no record of it in the ranger station's archives. But Mrs. Havisham's words echoed in his mind. The villagers disappeared overnight, without a trace. Some say the Watcher took them. Others say they left to escape something far worse. The thought of an entire village vanishing sent a chill down Ethan's spine. What could have caused such a thing? And why had it been forgotten, erased from the park's history? The questions gnawed at him, and he knew he couldn't ignore them any longer. If he was going to find answers, if he was going to survive, he needed to uncover the truth about the village and its connection to the Watcher. With a sense of grim determination, Ethan packed his gear, making sure to bring extra supplies. The village was located deep in the northern part of the park, far from any established trails. It would take hours to reach, and the terrain was treacherous. But he couldn't afford to hesitate. Whatever secrets the village held, they might be his only hope of understanding the ancient force that stalked him. The journey was slow and arduous, the forest growing denser and more tangled with each passing mile. The trees here were older, their trunks thick and gnarled, their branches interwoven like a massive living cage. The sunlight barely penetrated the canopy, casting everything in a perpetual twilight. Hours passed as Ethan made his way deeper into the heart of the park. The landscape became increasingly rugged, the ground uneven and covered in thick underbrush. Several times he had to stop and consult his map, trying to orient himself in the disorienting maze of trees. But despite the difficulty, he pressed on, driven by a sense of urgency he couldn't quite explain. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he came upon a narrow, overgrown trail that seemed to lead in the direction of the village. The path was barely discernible, choked with weeds and covered in fallen leaves. It was clear that no one had traveled this way in many years. But there was something else, an unnatural stillness in the air, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. Ethan's heart pounded in his chest as he followed the trail, every nerve on edge. The mist thickened, the trees closing in around him, and then through the haze he saw it, a cluster of dark shapes looming ahead. The village. The first building he approached was a small, crumbling structure made of weathered wood and stone. The roof had partially collapsed, and the windows were broken, their glass long gone. Ethan stepped inside, his flashlight cutting through the gloom. The air was thick with dust, and the floor was littered with debris, rotting wood, broken furniture, and the remnants of a life long abandoned. He moved through the village slowly, carefully, taking in the eerie silence that hung over the place like a shroud. Each building told the same story, empty, decaying, as if the inhabitants had simply vanished without a trace. There were no signs of a struggle, no evidence of where the villagers might have gone. It was as if they had been plucked from existence, leaving only their possessions behind. Ethan's unease grew with each step, the weight of the village's history pressing down on him. He couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched, that the shadows cast by the broken buildings were more than just tricks of the light. The Watcher's presence was here, palpable and suffocating, lurking just beyond the edge of his perception. In the center of the village, Ethan came upon a large, circular clearing, where the remains of a communal fire pit stood. Around the edges of the clearing were several stone benches, their surfaces worn smooth by time. And there, at the far end of the clearing, stood a structure that was different from the rest, larger, more imposing, and made of stone rather than wood. The building was a small chapel, its roof caved in, but its stone walls still standing strong. A sense of dread washed over Ethan as he approached the entrance, the wooden door hanging off its hinges. He pushed it open and stepped inside. The interior was dark and cold, the air thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The chapel was small, with a single row of wooden pews, most of which had rotted away. At the front of the room stood an altar made of the same stone as the walls, but covered in strange symbols, similar to the ones Ethan had seen carved into the trees near Station 21. He moved closer, his flashlight illuminating the symbols. They were intricate, winding patterns, their meaning lost to time. But there was something else, something that made Ethan's blood run cold. Behind the altar, etched into the stone wall, was a large circular symbol, a spiral with lines radiating out from its center. Ethan reached out, his fingers brushing against the cold stone. As he did, a low, rumbling sound echoed through the chapel, vibrating through the walls and the floor. He stepped back, his heart racing, as the ground beneath him began to tremble. Suddenly, the air was filled with a deafening roar, a sound that seemed to come from deep within the earth itself. The ground shook violently, cracks appearing in the stone floor. Ethan stumbled backward, his flashlight flickering as the walls of the chapel seemed to close in around him. And then, just as quickly as it had begun, the shaking stopped. The silence returned, more oppressive than before, as if the very air had been sucked out of the room. Ethan stood frozen, his breath coming in short, sharp gasps, his mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened. He turned his attention back to the altar, and his eyes widened in horror. The spiral symbol on the wall had changed. Where there had once been lines radiating out from the center, there were now dozens of small, jagged cracks, each one oozing a thick, black substance that looked like tar. The substance began to spread, creeping across the stone like a living thing, forming new patterns as it moved. Ethan watched in disbelief as the black ooze traced the symbols on the altar, connecting them in a way that hadn't been visible before. The patterns now formed a clear image, an eye staring directly at him. Ethan's blood ran cold. The Watcher was here, its presence unmistakable. The villagers hadn't just disappeared, they had been taken, claimed by whatever ancient force resided in this place. And now it was reaching out to him, pulling him deeper into its web. He had to get out. Ethan turned and ran from the chapel, his boots pounding against the uneven ground. He burst out into the clearing, the cold air hitting him like a slap to the face. But he didn't stop, didn't look back. He had seen enough. The village seemed to come alive as he fled, the mist swirling around him, the shadows growing darker and more twisted. He could feel the Watcher's presence closing in, pressing down on him from all sides. The trees loomed like sentinels, their branches reaching out like claws, trying to drag him back into the darkness. Ethan's lungs burned as he pushed himself to keep running, his heart pounding in his chest. The path ahead was barely visible, the mist thickening. But he didn't care. He had to get back to the cabin, had to put as much distance between himself and that cursed village as possible. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the trees began to thin, and the familiar sight of the cabin came into view. Ethan stumbled into the clearing, gasping for breath, his legs trembling with exhaustion. He reached the door, fumbling with the handle before finally shoving it open and collapsing inside. He slammed the door shut and locked it, his body shaking with adrenaline. The cabin was dark, the only light coming from the faint glow of the embers in the fireplace. But it was safe from the Watcher, from the village, from whatever dark forces had claimed the lives of those who had lived there. Ethan sank to the floor, his back against the door, his mind racing. He had uncovered part of the mystery, but at what cost? The Watcher was more powerful than he had ever imagined, its reach extending far beyond the boundaries of the forest, and now it had its sights set on him. The villagers had tried to escape, tried to flee from the darkness that had consumed their home. But they had failed, and now Ethan was in the same position, trapped in a battle against an ancient force that he couldn't hope to defeat. But he wasn't ready to give up. Not yet. Ethan pushed himself to his feet, his resolve hardening. He had come this far. He wasn't going to back down now. There had to be a way to stop the Watcher, to break the hold it had over the forest and over him. He moved to the table where the map still lay spread out. His hands were steady now, his fear replaced by a cold, determined focus. The village had given him answers, but it had also raised more questions. Questions that needed answers if he was going to survive. The Watcher was ancient, powerful, and relentless. But Ethan was a ranger, and he knew the land better than anyone. He would find a way to turn the forest against the creature, to use its own domain to defeat it. But for now, he needed to rest, to gather his strength for the battle that was to come. The Watcher had made its move, but Ethan wasn't about to be taken without a fight. He closed the map and headed to the cot, the weight of the day's revelations settling over him. The cabin was quiet, the only sound the soft crackle of the dying fire. But outside, the forest was alive with unseen eyes, watching, waiting. And Ethan knew that the real battle was only just beginning. Ethan sat on the edge of his cot, his body weighed down by exhaustion and the oppressive dread that had settled over Station 21. The events of the day, the discovery of the abandoned village, the strange malevolent symbols, the presence of the Watcher had drained him, both physically and mentally. But rest was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not now. The cabin was silent save for the occasional creak of the old wooden walls. Outside, the forest was shrouded in darkness, the mist thicker than ever. It was as if the very air was conspiring to suffocate him, to keep him trapped in this nightmarish place. Ethan's mind raced with thoughts of what he had uncovered, of the Watcher's growing presence, and of the unseen forces that seemed to be closing in around him. He knew that the Watcher wasn't just some malevolent spirit haunting the woods. It was something far older, something tied to the land itself. And now, whatever it was, it had him in its sights. The sense of being watched had grown stronger since his return from the village, an almost tangible presence that seemed to linger just beyond the reach of his senses. He reached for the small notebook on the table, flipping through the pages of hastily scrawled notes and sketches. The symbols from the village, the spiral, the black substance that had oozed from the walls. It all pointed to something ancient and dark, something that had been buried in these woods for centuries. But what was it? And what did it want? The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and causing the door to groan on its hinges. Ethan looked up, his grip tightening on the notebook. He could feel the Watcher's presence pressing against the walls of the cabin like a storm waiting to break. It was as if the entire forest was alive with a dark energy, a force that was slowly but surely tightening its grip on him. Suddenly, the cabin was plunged into darkness as the last embers in the fireplace died out, leaving Ethan in complete silence. His breath caught in his throat, and he instinctively reached for the flashlight on the table, flicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the small room, but it did little to ease the growing sense of unease. The radio, which had been silent since the morning, crackled to life with a burst of static. Ethan jumped, his heart pounding in his chest as he turned the dial, trying to tune in the signal. The static fluctuated, rising and falling, but no voice emerged, just the same maddening hiss. He slammed his fist on the table in frustration, the sound echoing through the empty cabin. He was losing control, losing his grip on reality. The isolation, the fear, the unseen forces closing in on him. It was all becoming too much. And then, through the static, he heard it. A voice, faint and distorted, barely audible over the noise. "Ethan, can you hear me?" He froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was familiar, but it was distant, as if it was coming from a great distance, or perhaps from another time entirely. "Ethan, listen to me," the voice continued, breaking up as the static surged. "You need to get out. Can't stay. Watcher is coming for you." The connection flickered, and the voice was swallowed by the static once more. Ethan gripped the radio, desperate to hear more, but the signal was gone, leaving him alone in the dark. He sat back, his mind reeling. The voice, was it real or just another trick of the Watcher? Was someone trying to warn him, or was it the forest itself playing with his mind? The questions swirled in his head, each one more unsettling than the last. He had to do something, had to take action before the Watcher made its next move. But what could he do? The creature was beyond anything he had ever encountered, an unseen force that could manipulate the very fabric of reality. Ethan stood, pacing the small cabin as he tried to think. The village, the symbols, the warnings, they were all connected, pieces of a puzzle that he needed to solve if he was going to survive. But time was running out. He could feel the Watcher's presence growing stronger, its influence seeping into every corner of the forest. He stopped by the window, staring out into the darkness. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches swaying in the wind. But there was something else, something moving among the trees. He squinted, trying to make out the shape, but the mist obscured everything, turning the landscape into a shadowy blur. And then he saw it, a figure, tall and dark, standing just beyond the edge of the clearing. The Watcher. It was closer than ever, its form shifting and flickering in the mist. Ethan's breath caught in his throat as the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, toward the cabin. He backed away from the window, his heart racing. The Watcher wasn't just watching him anymore, it was coming for him. He could feel it, a cold, oppressive force that pressed down on him from all sides. The walls of the cabin seemed to close in around him, the air growing thick and heavy. The wind outside howled, and the shadows deepened, as if the forest itself was conspiring against him. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here. He had to move, had to get away from the cabin before the Watcher reached him. But where could he go? The forest was vast and treacherous, and the Watcher was everywhere, its presence woven into the very fabric of the land. The voice on the radio had warned him to leave, but there was nowhere to run. He was trapped, surrounded by an ancient force that was beyond his understanding. And then it hit him. The symbols. The symbols in the village, the ones carved into the trees near the cabin. They weren't just warnings, they were markers, points of power that the Watcher used to manifest itself. If he could find a way to disrupt those symbols, to break the connection between the Watcher and the land, he might have a chance. It was a long shot, but it was the only plan he had. Ethan grabbed his gear, strapping on his knife, flashlight, and flare gun. He had to move quickly before the Watcher closed in. The first set of symbols was just outside the cabin, carved into the trees at the edge of the clearing. He would start there. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come. The cabin felt like a tomb, a place of death and decay, and he had no intention of dying here. Ethan threw open the door and stepped out into the cold night air. The wind howled through the trees, and the mist swirled around him. But he pushed forward, his flashlight cutting through the darkness. The first tree was just ahead, its trunk marked with the same strange, intricate symbols he had seen in the village. Ethan approached it cautiously, his heart pounding in his chest. He had no idea what would happen if he disrupted the symbols, but he had to try. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a piece of chalk, the same one he had used to replicate the symbols earlier. But this time, instead of copying them, he would alter them, break their pattern, and see what happened. With a shaking hand, Ethan began to draw over the symbols, disrupting the lines, connecting them in ways they weren't meant to be connected. The air around him grew colder, the wind more intense, but he kept going, his mind focused on the task. As he finished the last line, a low rumble echoed through the forest, the ground beneath him trembling. Ethan stepped back, watching as the symbols on the tree seemed to pulse with a dark energy, the lines writhing as if they were alive. And then, with a sound like a crack of thunder, the tree split down the middle, the symbols shattering into fragments. The force of the explosion knocked Ethan off his feet, sending him sprawling to the ground. He lay there, dazed, the world spinning around him. The wind had stopped and the forest was eerily silent, but the Watcher was still out there. He could feel it, lurking just beyond the edge of the clearing, waiting. Ethan forced himself to his feet, his body aching from the impact. The tree was a smoldering ruin, the symbols completely destroyed. But the Watcher hadn't retreated. In fact, its presence felt stronger than ever, as if the destruction of the symbols had only angered it. He stumbled back toward the cabin, his mind racing. He had to find the other symbols, had to destroy them before the Watcher made its move. But time was running out. He could feel the darkness closing in, the unseen forces tightening their grip on him. The next set of symbols was farther into the woods, near the old trail that led to the village. Ethan moved quickly, his flashlight bobbing in the darkness as he navigated the twisted roots and uneven ground. The forest was alive with shadows, the mist thickening as he pushed deeper into the trees. Finally, he found the second tree, its trunk marked with the same ominous symbols. He approached it, his heart pounding, and began to alter the patterns, breaking the lines just as he had done before. But this time, the response was immediate. The ground beneath him shook violently, the air filled with a high-pitched wail that seemed to come from all directions at once. The tree groaned, its trunk splintering as the symbols shattered. Ethan was thrown back by the force of the explosion, his body hitting the ground hard. Pain shot through him as he struggled to breathe. The wind knocked out of him. He lay there, gasping for air, the world spinning around him. The wailing had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that pressed down on him like a physical weight. The Watcher's presence was overwhelming now, a dark, oppressive force that seemed to seep into his very bones. Ethan knew he couldn't continue like this. He was running out of time and the Watcher was closing in. He needed to find the final set of symbols, needed to disrupt them before the creature made its move. But as he pushed himself to his feet, he realized with growing horror that he didn't know where the final symbols were. He had seen them before during his patrols, but the forest had changed. The paths twisted, the landmarks obscured by the mist. He was lost. Panic surged through him as he tried to get his bearings, but the forest had become a maze, the trees closing in around him like a trap. The darkness was absolute, the mist so thick that he could barely see a few feet ahead. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl coming from just behind him. Ethan froze, his blood turning to ice. The growl was deep and resonant, filled with a primal anger that sent shivers down his spine. The Watcher was here. Slowly he turned, his flashlight trembling in his hand. The beam cut through the mist, revealing nothing but shadows and twisted branches. But he could feel the Watcher's presence, could sense it just beyond the edge of the light, waiting for him to make a move. His mind raced, trying to come up with a plan, but the fear was paralyzing. He had no more tricks, no more symbols to disrupt, no way to fight back. He was at the mercy of the Watcher, and it was closing in. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the trees. Ethan's breath came in short, ragged gasps as he backed away, his every instinct screaming at him to run, but his legs felt like lead. And then, through the fog, he saw it. A tall, dark figure emerging from the mist, its form shifting and flickering like a living shadow. The Watcher. It stood there, motionless, its hollow eyes locked onto his. The air around it seemed to warp and twist, the very fabric of reality bending in its presence. Ethan knew there was no escape. The Watcher had him, and it wasn't going to let him go. But then, something unexpected happened. The Watcher paused, its form flickering, as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. The ground beneath Ethan's feet began to tremble, the trees around him swaying as a deep, rumbling sound filled the air. The symbols, the destruction of the symbols, it had weakened the Watcher. Ethan didn't hesitate. He raised the flare gun, aiming it at the creature, and fired. The flare shot out with a blinding flash of light, striking the Watcher in the center of its chest. The creature recoiled, its form distorting as the light burned through it. For a moment it seemed to waver, its outline flickering like a dying flame. And then, with a sound like a crack of thunder, it exploded, the darkness shattering into 1,000 fragments that were carried away by the wind. Ethan stood there, staring at the spot where the Watcher had been, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The forest was silent, the mist beginning to lift as the first light of dawn broke through the trees. The Watcher was gone, for now, but Ethan knew it wasn't over. The unseen forces that had bound the creature to this land were still out there, still powerful, and they wouldn't rest until they had reclaimed what was theirs. He lowered the flare gun, his hands shaking with exhaustion. He had survived the night, but he knew the battle was far from over. The forest had many more secrets to reveal, and the Watcher would return. And when it did, Ethan would be ready. But for now, he needed to rest to gather his strength for the next encounter. He turned and began the long walk back to the cabin, the weight of the unseen forces pressing down on him with every step. The Watcher was gone, but its influence lingered, woven into the very fabric of the forest. And Ethan knew that he was still very much in its sights. The forest was different now. The air was thick with a tense, expectant energy that hummed just beneath the surface of reality. It was as if the very land itself was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen, something dark and inevitable. Ethan Cole felt it too, deep in his bones, a gnawing sense of urgency that had kept him on edge ever since the night of his encounter with the Watcher. He hadn't slept well, the brief moments of rest he managed filled with nightmares of shadowy figures and unseen forces pressing in on him. The Watcher was gone, at least for now, but Ethan knew that the reprieve was only temporary. The destruction of the symbols had weakened it, but it hadn't banished it. If anything, it had only angered the ancient entity, and Ethan had no doubt that it would return, stronger and more determined than before. He needed to end this once and for all, and he knew there was only one way to do it. The ritual. Mrs. Haversham's words echoed in his mind. The settlers used it in their rituals, trying to appease the Watcher or bind it to their will. She had warned him that the rituals were dangerous, that they had ultimately failed, but Ethan was out of options. If he was going to survive, he needed to understand the ritual and use it to his advantage. But first, he had to find the site where the ritual had originally been performed. Ethan stood at the edge of the clearing outside the cabin, staring out at the mist-shrouded trees. The wind had picked up, rustling the leaves and sending a chill through the air. He had spent the last few hours studying the maps and the notes he had taken from his encounters, trying to piece together the clues that would lead him to the ritual site. The symbols, the village, the chapel, they were all connected. Pieces of a puzzle that pointed to a single location deep within the heart of the forest. He had marked the spot on his map, a small, isolated clearing far to the north, beyond even the abandoned village. It was a place that hadn't been visited in decades, if not centuries. A place where the lines between the physical world and the unseen forces that governed the land blurred. It was a long shot, but it was the only chance he had. Ethan adjusted his pack, making sure he had everything he needed for the journey. The flare gun, the flashlight, the knife, and the portable signal booster. All of it felt woefully inadequate in the face of what he was about to do. But he had no other choice. He couldn't stay here waiting for the Watcher to strike again. He had to take the fight to it. He set off down the narrow path that led deeper into the forest, his senses on high alert. The mist clung to the ground, swirling around his feet like a living thing, and the trees loomed overhead, their branches interlocking to form a dense canopy that blocked out most of the light. The further he walked, the more the forest seemed to close in around him, the air growing thicker, the shadows deeper. The journey was grueling, the terrain rugged and unforgiving. The path he had marked on his map was little more than a faint trail, overgrown with weeds and choked with underbrush. Several times he had to stop and check his bearings, making sure he was still on course. The forest had a way of twisting the landscape, making it easy to lose your way. But Ethan pushed forward, driven by a determination that bordered on desperation. Hours passed, the light shifting from dull gray to the deep orange of late afternoon. The air grew colder, the wind biting at his skin, but Ethan barely noticed. His mind was focused on the task ahead, on the ritual he was about to perform. Finally, as the sun dipped low on the horizon, he reached the clearing. It was exactly as he had imagined it, an open space surrounded by towering trees, the ground covered in a thick layer of moss and fallen leaves. The air was still, unnaturally so, and the sense of being watched was stronger here than anywhere else in the forest. Ethan set down his pack and took a deep breath, trying to steady his nerves. This was it, the place where the settlers had performed the ritual that had bound the Watcher to the land. The place where he would either succeed in banishing the ancient entity or fail and become its next victim. He reached into his pack and pulled out the items he had gathered: a piece of chalk, a small knife, and a bundle of dried herbs that Mrs. Havisham had given him. She had told him that these herbs were used in the old rituals, believed to have protective properties against dark forces. Ethan didn't know if they would work, but he wasn't about to leave anything to chance. He began by drawing a large circle in the center of the clearing, carefully marking the lines with the chalk. The circle was meant to be a barrier, a way to contain the Watcher and prevent it from escaping once the ritual began. Around the edges of the circle, he drew the symbols he had seen in the village, altering them slightly to disrupt their original patterns. If Mrs. Havisham was right, these symbols would weaken the Watcher, make it vulnerable. Next, he placed the bundle of herbs in the center of the circle, arranging them in a pattern that mimicked the spiral symbol he had seen on the wall of the chapel. The spiral was key. It was the focal point of the ritual, the point where the physical world and the unseen forces converged. It was here that the settlers had tried to bind the Watcher, and it was here that Ethan would try to break that bond. As he finished the preparations, the wind began to pick up, swirling through the clearing with a cold, biting intensity. The shadows lengthened, the trees swaying as if in response to some unseen force. Ethan could feel the Watcher's presence growing stronger, the air around him charged with a dark energy that made his skin prickle. He stood at the edge of the circle, the knife in his hand, his heart pounding in his chest. The ritual required blood. His blood. It was the final component, the offering that would either bind the Watcher to him or break its hold on the land. With a steady hand, Ethan pressed the blade to his palm, the sharp edge biting into his skin. Blood welled up, dark and thick, and he let it drip onto the herbs in the center of the circle. The wind howled in response, the trees creaking and groaning as the dark energy swirled around him. He began to speak the words he had memorized from Mrs. Havisham's old books, the ancient incantation that had been passed down through generations. The words felt foreign on his tongue, but he forced himself to continue, his voice rising above the wind. As he spoke, the ground beneath him began to tremble, the air growing thick with the scent of earth and decay. The symbols around the circle pulsed with a dark light, the lines writhing as if they were alive. The spiral at the center of the circle began to glow, the herbs crackling as they burned with an unnatural fire. And then, with a sound like a crack of thunder, the Watcher appeared. It emerged from the shadows at the edge of the clearing, its form tall and dark, shifting and flickering like a living shadow. The air around it warped and twisted, the very fabric of reality bending in its presence. Its eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto Ethan, and he felt a wave of cold dread wash over him. The Watcher stepped into the circle, its form flickering as it crossed the boundary. The symbols around the edge pulsed with a fierce, blinding light, and the creature recoiled, its form distorting as the light struck it. But it didn't retreat. It couldn't. The circle held it in place, trapped by the very forces it had once controlled. Ethan continued the incantation, his voice shaking but unwavering. The spiral at the center of the circle burned brighter, the herbs consumed by the flames. The Watcher writhed in pain, its form flickering like a dying flame. But it didn't vanish. It was too strong, too ancient to be banished so easily. The wind howled through the clearing, the trees bending under its force. The ground trembled, the air thick with dark energy. Ethan could feel the Watcher's power pressing down on him, its malevolent will fighting to break free from the ritual's hold. He had to finish it, had to complete the ritual before the Watcher broke loose. With a final desperate surge of strength, Ethan raised the knife and slashed his palm again, letting the blood flow freely onto the spiral. The flames roared to life, the light blinding, the air filled with the sound of the Watcher's anguished roar. And then, with a deafening explosion of light and sound, the ritual was complete. The Watcher's form shattered, dissolving into a mass of swirling shadows that were carried away by the wind. The flames in the circle died out, the symbols around the edge crumbling to dust. The ground stopped trembling, the wind fell silent, and the oppressive darkness that had surrounded the clearing lifted. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. The ritual had worked. The Watcher was gone. The dark force that had haunted the forest for centuries had been banished, its hold on the land broken. But as he knelt there, breathing heavily, he realized that something was wrong. The forest was too quiet, too still. The energy that had filled the air, the dark presence that had weighed on him for days, it was gone. But in its place was a deep, unsettling emptiness, a void that seemed to stretch out endlessly. Ethan struggled to his feet, his mind racing. The ritual had worked, but at what cost? The Watcher was gone, but so was something else, something vital, something that had kept the balance in this ancient, mysterious place. The forest was no longer alive with unseen forces. It was dead. Ethan staggered out of the clearing, the weight of his actions pressing down on him. The trees were still, the air cold and lifeless. The land that had once been vibrant with energy, however dark and malevolent, was now a hollow shell. He had won, but it didn't feel like a victory. The Watcher had been a part of this land for centuries, a guardian as much as a threat. In his desperation to survive, Ethan had disrupted that balance, and now the forest was paying the price. He walked through the dead woods, his footsteps echoing in the silence. The mist had lifted, but the sky was gray and heavy, the sun hidden behind thick clouds. There were no animals, no birds, no signs of life, just the endless, empty trees. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here, couldn't remain in this place he had inadvertently destroyed. The land would never be the same, and neither would he. As he made his way back to the cabin, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had lost something precious, something that could never be regained. The Watcher was gone, but so was the ancient magic that had once pulsed through the forest, the unseen forces that had made this place unique, terrifying, and alive. He reached the cabin just as the first drops of rain began to fall, the cold wind biting at his skin. The cabin was as he had left it, a lonely structure in the middle of a dead forest. He stepped inside, closing the door behind him, and sat down at the table, staring out at the desolate landscape. The ritual had saved him, but it had cost him everything. Ethan leaned back in the chair, closing his eyes as the rain pattered against the roof. The forest was silent, empty, and lifeless. The Watcher was gone, but the cost had been too high. He had survived, but he was left wondering if it had been worth it. The rain continued to fall in a steady, relentless downpour, soaking the forest and turning the ground to mud. The once vibrant landscape was now a desolate wasteland, a hollow echo of what it had been. The air was thick with the scent of damp earth and decay, and the oppressive silence weighed heavily on Ethan as he sat in the cabin, staring out at the lifeless trees. The Watcher was gone, but the victory had come at a price Ethan had never anticipated. The forest, once filled with dark energy and ancient power, was now dead. The ritual had severed the connection between the Watcher and the land, but in doing so, it had also drained the forest of the very life force that had sustained it. Ethan had spent the last few hours trying to come to terms with what he had done, but the guilt weighed on him like a leaden cloak. The Watcher had been a malevolent force, yes, but it had also been a guardian, a vital part of the delicate balance that had kept the forest alive. In his desperation to survive, Ethan had disrupted that balance, and now the consequences were clear. The world outside the cabin was empty, devoid of the vibrancy that had once defined it. The forest had become a shadow of its former self, and Ethan couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly, irrevocably wrong. He knew he couldn't stay here. The land was poisoned, and the cabin felt like a tomb, suffocating in its silence. But as he prepared to leave, gathering his gear and making sure he had everything he needed, a familiar gnawing sensation began to creep over him, the sense that he was not alone. Ethan paused, his hand hovering over the door handle. The Watcher was gone. He had seen it destroyed, its form shattered and carried away by the wind. But the feeling of being watched, of something unseen lurking just beyond the edge of his perception, was as strong as ever. He slowly turned, his eyes scanning the cabin. The shadows seemed deeper, darker, as if they were alive, shifting and pulsing with a malevolent energy. The air was thick, heavy with the same dark presence he had felt since he first arrived at Station 21. And then he heard it, a low, guttural growl resonating through the walls of the cabin. Ethan's heart skipped a beat, the sound sending a cold shiver down his spine. He recognized that growl. It was the same sound that had haunted him ever since his first encounter with the Watcher. But how could it be? The Watcher was gone, destroyed by the ritual. He had seen it with his own eyes. The growl came again, closer this time, reverberating through the floorboards. Ethan backed away from the door, his mind racing. The ritual had been successful, he was sure of it. But something was still out there, something powerful and angry. His hand tightened around the handle of the flare gun, his only real weapon against the darkness. The knife at his belt felt inadequate, and the flashlight seemed a weak defense against whatever force was closing in on him. The growl deepened, the sound filling the cabin, making the walls tremble. It was everywhere, surrounding him, pressing in on him from all sides. Ethan's breath came in short, panicked bursts as he tried to make sense of what was happening. And then, with a sudden, bone-chilling realization, it dawned on him. The ritual hadn't destroyed the Watcher. It had only freed it. The Watcher had been bound to the land, its power anchored to the ancient symbols and the dark forces that had sustained the forest for centuries. The ritual had severed that connection, breaking the bonds that had kept the Watcher contained. But instead of destroying the creature, it had released it, unleashing its full power on the world. The forest had been a prison, and Ethan had unwittingly opened the door. He cursed under his breath, his mind racing as he tried to think of a way out. The Watcher was no longer tied to the land, no longer confined by the boundaries of the forest. It was free to do as it pleased, and it was coming for him. Ethan knew he had only one option. He had to confront the Watcher, face it head-on, and find a way to stop it before it could escape into the world beyond the forest. It was a suicidal plan, but there was no other choice. If he didn't act now, the consequences would be catastrophic. The cabin shook as the growl intensified, the sound now a deafening roar that seemed to come from within the very walls. Ethan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to move. He grabbed his pack and slung it over his shoulder, the flare gun in his hand, and pushed open the door. The world outside was a maelstrom of darkness and rain. The trees loomed like silent sentinels, their branches twisted and blackened. The ground was slick with mud, and the air was thick with the scent of decay. But through the chaos, Ethan could sense the Watcher's presence, an overwhelming force that seemed to radiate from the very heart of the forest. He took a deep breath, steeling himself for what was to come, and stepped out into the storm. The wind howled around him, whipping the rain into his face as he made his way toward the source of the Watcher's power. The shadows moved and twisted, the darkness alive with unseen forces that seemed to reach out for him. But he pressed on, driven by a grim determination. The growl was louder now, a constant, throbbing sound that seemed to resonate through the very ground beneath his feet. The trees swayed and creaked, their branches reaching out like claws, and the air was thick with a malevolent energy that made his skin crawl. Ethan followed the pull of the Watcher's presence, his footsteps sure and steady despite the chaos around him. The forest had become a labyrinth, the paths twisting and shifting as if they were alive, but he navigated them with a single-minded focus. Finally, after what felt like hours of trudging through the storm, he reached the clearing where the ritual had taken place. But it was no longer the serene, lifeless place he had left behind. The ground was torn and churned, the symbols he had drawn obliterated by the forces that had been unleashed. The air was thick with a dark, oppressive energy, and at the center of the clearing stood the Watcher. It was larger now, its form towering above the trees, its body a mass of swirling shadows and darkness. The air around it crackled with energy, and the ground trembled beneath its weight. Its eyes, dark, hollow voids, locked onto Ethan as he entered the clearing, and the growl deepened, a sound filled with rage and hatred. Ethan raised the flare gun, his hands shaking as he aimed it at the creature. The Watcher loomed before him, its presence overwhelming, suffocating. But he didn't back down. He couldn't. This was his final stand, his last chance to stop the creature before it was too late. The Watcher moved, its form shifting and flickering as it approached, the ground trembling with each step. The wind howled, the trees bending under its force, but Ethan stood his ground, the flare gun steady in his hand. He fired. The flare shot out with a blinding flash of light, striking the Watcher in the center of its chest. The creature recoiled, its form flickering as the light burned through it. For a moment it seemed to waver, its outline blurring as if it was struggling to maintain its shape. But the flare wasn't enough. The Watcher roared, a sound that shook the very earth, and the light of the flare was swallowed by the darkness. The creature surged forward, its form solidifying as it closed the distance between them. Ethan's mind raced, his heart pounding in his chest. The flare gun had failed. The Watcher was too powerful, too ancient to be destroyed by such a simple weapon. He needed something more, something that could strike at the very heart of the creature's power. And then he remembered the spiral. The spiral symbol had been the focal point of the ritual, the point where the physical world and the unseen forces converged. It was the key, the one thing that had the power to bind the Watcher or destroy it. Ethan dropped the flare gun and pulled the small knife from his belt. The Watcher was almost upon him, its form towering above him, but he didn't flinch. With a quick, determined movement, he slashed his palm and let the blood drip onto the ground. The earth beneath him began to tremble, the spiral pattern he had drawn earlier, faintly glowing in the dark soil. The Watcher paused, its form flickering as it sensed the change in the air. Ethan knelt and traced the spiral with his blood, completing the pattern with deliberate, precise movements. The ground shook violently, the air crackling with energy as the spiral began to glow brighter, the light cutting through the darkness. The Watcher roared, its form writhing as the spiral's power surged through it, disrupting the very fabric of its being. Ethan stood, his hand still bleeding as he faced the creature. The spiral had been the key all along, a symbol of power, of life and death, of the balance that had once governed the forest. The Watcher had been bound by it, and now it would be destroyed by it. The light of the spiral intensified, the ground splitting open as the energy reached its peak. The Watcher howled in rage, its form collapsing in on itself, the shadows disintegrating as the light consumed it. Ethan took a step back, his breath coming in short, ragged gasps as the creature was torn apart by the spiral's power. The ground shook, the trees swayed, and the wind howled, but the light of the spiral burned brighter, cutting through the darkness. And then, with a final deafening roar, the Watcher exploded into a cloud of black smoke, the shadows dissipating as they were carried away by the wind. The ground stopped shaking, the air fell silent, and the spiral's light slowly faded, leaving only the faint glow of the dying embers in the earth. Ethan collapsed to his knees, his body trembling with exhaustion. It was over. The Watcher was gone. Truly gone this time, its power shattered by the very force that had once bound it to the land. The forest was still, the air heavy with the scent of rain and earth. The oppressive darkness that had hung over the land was gone, replaced by a quiet, peaceful silence. Ethan looked up at the sky, the clouds beginning to break, revealing the faint light of dawn on the horizon. The storm had passed, and with it the Watcher's reign of terror. He had won, but the victory felt hollow. The forest, once vibrant and alive, was now a graveyard, a place of death and decay. The land had been scarred by the battle, and Ethan knew that it would never be the same. He slowly got to his feet, his body aching from the strain of the fight. The cabin was still there, standing alone in the clearing, a solitary reminder of the life he had left behind. Ethan knew he couldn't stay. The forest was no longer his home. It was a place of memories, of battles fought and lost, of sacrifices made in the name of survival. He turned and walked away, leaving the cabin, the clearing, and the forest behind. The road ahead was long and uncertain, but it was the only path left to him. As he disappeared into the mist, the forest remained silent, the echoes of the final battle fading into the distance. The Watcher was gone, and with it, the darkness that had haunted the land for centuries. But Ethan knew that the scars would remain, a reminder of the cost of survival, of the price he had paid to reclaim his life. And as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Ethan Cole walked into a new day, leaving the past behind, but never forgetting the final stand that had defined him. Ethan Cole trudged down the narrow, winding trail, the weight of his pack pulling at his shoulders, though it was nothing compared to the burden of what he had left behind. The forest was slowly coming to life as dawn broke, the soft light filtering through the trees, casting long shadows on the ground. It should have been a moment of relief, a sign that the darkness was finally retreating, but all Ethan felt was a deep, hollow emptiness. The Watcher was gone, the forest was free, but the cost had been unimaginable. He paused at the crest of a small hill, looking back one last time at the path that led to Station 21. The cabin was out of sight now, hidden behind the dense trees and the twists of the trail. It felt like another world, another lifetime, where he had fought a battle against forces older and darker than anything he had ever known. But it was over now, and all that remained were the memories. Memories that would haunt him for the rest of his life. The forest, once alive with unseen forces, now felt empty and barren. The vibrant energy that had once pulsed through the land was gone, leaving behind a lifeless, hollow shell. The trees, though standing, seemed devoid of spirit, their branches heavy with the weight of the silence that hung over the land. There was no bird song, no rustling of animals in the underbrush, just the quiet, oppressive stillness that marked the end of something ancient and powerful. Ethan's heart ached with the knowledge of what he had done. The ritual had destroyed the Watcher, severed the connection that had bound it to the land for centuries. But in doing so, it had also drained the forest of the very life that had sustained it. The land had paid the price for his survival, and now it was a shadow of what it once had been. He couldn't shake the feeling that he had been a part of something much larger than himself, something that had stretched back through time, through the lives of those who had come before him. The settlers who had first performed the ritual, the villagers who had disappeared, the previous rangers who had tried and failed to understand the forces at work. All of them were tied to the forest, to the Watcher, to the same ancient power that had now been destroyed. Ethan continued down the trail, the path growing steeper as it wound its way through the trees. His steps were heavy, his body exhausted, but he pressed on, driven by a need to leave this place behind. There was nothing left for him here. The forest, the cabin, the memories, they were all part of a chapter that had finally come to a close. But as he walked, his mind kept drifting back to the final moments of the ritual, to the spiral that had glowed with a fierce, blinding light, to the Watcher's roar as it was torn apart by the forces that had been unleashed. He had won, but at what cost? The question echoed in his mind, a constant reminder of the price that had been paid. The path leveled out as he reached the edge of the forest, where the trees thinned and the sky opened up above him. The light of dawn was stronger here, the sky tinged with the soft pinks and oranges of a new day. But Ethan felt no comfort in the sight. The beauty of the morning was a stark contrast to the darkness that still lingered in his heart. He paused at the tree line, looking out over the rolling hills and valleys that stretched out before him. The world beyond the forest was waiting, full of life and light, but it felt foreign to him now, as if he no longer belonged to it. He had been changed by the forest, by the battle he had fought, by the knowledge of the ancient forces that had once ruled the land. Ethan took a deep breath, the crisp morning air filling his lungs. The Watcher was gone, but the memory of it would stay with him forever. It was a part of him now, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went. As he stood there, staring out at the world beyond the forest, he couldn't help but feel a pang of regret. The forest had been a place of darkness, of fear, of ancient malevolent forces. But it had also been alive, vibrant, a place where the boundaries between the natural world and the supernatural blurred. Now it was just a place, stripped of its power, its magic gone. Ethan knew he couldn't stay here, couldn't dwell on what had been lost. He had to move forward, had to find a way to live with what he had done. The world beyond the forest was still full of life, full of possibilities, and he had to believe that there was still a place for him in it. He adjusted his pack and took a step forward, crossing the threshold from the forest into the open land beyond. The path ahead was uncertain, the future unknown, but he had survived. He had faced the darkness and come out the other side. That had to mean something. But as he walked away from the forest, the shadows of the past still clung to him, a reminder of the battle he had fought, of the forces he had unleashed. The Watcher was gone, but the scars remained, on the land, on the forest, and on his soul. Ethan didn't know where the path would lead him, didn't know what the future held, but as he walked away from Station 21, he couldn't help but glance back one last time, the memories of the final battle still fresh in his mind. The cabin was out of sight now, hidden behind the trees, but in his mind's eye he could still see it, could still feel the weight of the ancient forces that had once held sway over the land. The forest was quiet, empty, but the echoes of the past lingered, a constant reminder of what had been lost. Ethan turned away, his gaze fixed on the horizon. The world beyond the forest was waiting, full of life and light, and he had to believe that there was still a place for him in it. But as he walked into the dawn, the shadows of the past followed him, a silent reminder of the final stand he had made, of the battle he had fought, and of the price he had paid. And in the quiet of the early morning, as the first rays of sunlight broke through the clouds, Ethan Cole knew that the Watcher was gone, but the story was far from over. It was just the beginning. The world beyond the forest was full of life, full of possibilities, full of new challenges, and Ethan Cole was ready to face them, one step at a time. But the forest, the cabin, the memories, they would stay with him forever, a shadow that would follow him wherever he went. The Watcher was gone, but the aftermath of its presence lingered, a reminder that some battles never truly end. And as Ethan Cole walked into the new day, he knew that the journey ahead would be long. But he was ready, because survival was just the beginning.